The early morning air was cold and quiet as the sun began to rise over the military base. The world still felt half asleep, but for Colonel Harris the day had already started hours ago. He stood in front of the mirror in his small on-base quarters, straightening his uniform with slow, careful movements. Every button, every fold, every badge had to be perfect. Not because anyone had ordered him to do it that way, but because of what this day meant. He wasn't traveling for a mission or a ceremony. He was escorting a fallen soldier home. The soldier had served under his command, a young man barely in his 20s. He had joined the military full of dreams, talking about how he wanted to make a difference and make his family proud. Now that young man was gone, and it was Colonel Harris's duty, his honor, to take him home to his family for the final goodbye. He looked down at the folded papers on his desk. His travel documents, authorization papers, and the escort order signed and sealed by his superiors. He had done this kind of duty before, but somehow each time felt heavier than the last. No matter how many medals a soldier carried or how long they had served, the weight of loss never became easier. He placed the papers neatly in a folder, adjusted the flag pin on his chest, and exhaled slowly. Then he whispered quietly to himself, "Let's bring him home." Outside, the base was calm. A few soldiers saluted him as he passed, and he nodded in return, his step steady but his mind deep in thought. The car that would take him to the airport was waiting at the gate. The driver, a young private, quickly stepped out and opened the door. "Morning, sir," the driver said softly. "Morning," Harris replied with a respectful nod. They drove in silence for most of the way. The roads were nearly empty, the sun climbing slowly into the sky. Harris stared out the window, thinking about the soldiers' parents, how they would stand by the flag-draped casket and try to hold back tears. He had done this before, seen mothers and fathers crumble in his arms, seen families who could hardly stand when the final salute was given. Yet he also knew how much it meant to them that someone had cared enough to bring their loved one home properly. Halfway to the airport, the driver broke the silence. "Sir, if you don't mind me saying, that's a real honor what you're doing." Harris gave a faint smile. "It's the least any of us can do." The young driver nodded, not sure what else to say. The rest of the ride passed quietly. When they arrived at the airport, the military transport truck carrying the fallen soldier's casket was already there. Two uniformed personnel stood beside it, their expressions serious and respectful. Harris approached and signed the necessary paperwork, confirming the transfer. The casket, draped with the American flag, was loaded carefully into a designated area for transport. Passengers inside the terminal had no idea that just outside the glass windows, a soldier's final journey was being prepared. Inside the airport, Harris carried only a small bag, a few essentials, his documents, and the duty orders. He was traveling in uniform, as required when escorting remains, and it wasn't unusual for people to glance at him with a mix of curiosity and respect. Some smiled politely, others looked unsure how to react. He was used to that. At the check-in counter, he approached calmly, setting his folder down and offering a polite greeting to the airline employee. "Good morning. I'm traveling under official military orders. I'm escorting a fallen soldier's remains to Atlanta," he said, sliding the documents forward. The woman behind the counter glanced briefly at the papers, then at him. "One moment, please," she said, typing something into her computer. Harris waited patiently, his hands folded in front of him. He'd done this enough times to know it could take a few minutes for verification. As he waited, he looked around. Families with kids, people rushing for business trips, travelers checking their phones. The everyday hum of airport life carried on around him. He wondered how many of them ever thought about the soldiers who never made it home. The ones who came back silently, in caskets instead of uniforms. The woman looked up again, frowning slightly. "Sir, I'm not finding this authorization code in our system." "That's strange," Harris said calmly. "It should be registered through the Department of Defense Escort Travel Agreement." "It's standard procedure," she typed again, then shook her head. "It's not coming up. Maybe you can purchase a ticket while we sort it out?" He blinked, slightly surprised. "Ma'am, this is a military escort mission. I'm not traveling on personal business." She gave a tight smile. "I understand, sir, but without confirmation in our system, I can't issue the boarding pass." Harris kept his tone even, professional. "Would you like me to have the base transportation officer contact your department? They can verify the travel authorization immediately." The woman hesitated, clearly unsure. Then another employee came over, a man, older, wearing a supervisor badge. He glanced at the uniform, the folder, and then at Harris himself. "What's the issue?" the supervisor asked. "He's saying he's a military escort, but I can't find the code in the system," the woman explained. The man turned to Harris. "Sir, do you have any other identification? Military ID, maybe?" Harris handed it over without a word. The man studied it carefully, then looked back up. "Where's the soldier's remains now?" "In the transport bay," Harris said, his voice quiet but firm. "The flight manifest includes one casket transfer under military protocol." The man frowned slightly. "And you're sure you're authorized to escort it?" For a moment, Harris simply looked at him, not sure how to respond. He had explained everything, shown documents, and identified himself properly. Yet the tone and that quiet doubt cut deeper than he expected. He'd faced bias before, subtle or not, but it always stung when it came at moments like this. "Yes," Harris said evenly. "I'm sure." The supervisor nodded slowly, then said, "All right, I'll check with my manager. Please step aside for a moment." Harris stepped aside, standing near the counter as people walked past. Some glanced at him, maybe curious about the uniform, maybe wondering what the delay was. He stood straight, his posture calm and disciplined, but inside, a mix of frustration and disbelief stirred. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The escort process was meant to be smooth and respectful. There was a fallen soldier waiting, and he was being treated like an inconvenience. Minutes stretched into nearly half an hour. Finally, the supervisor returned, his expression unreadable. "Sir, I'm afraid we can't process your boarding right now. There's been a hold placed on military escort travel under this authorization code. You'll need to contact your command office to sort it out." Harris took a slow breath. "You're saying I can't board the flight?" "Not until we clear this up," the man replied. "You can rebook once it's verified." The words hit him like a quiet blow. He had promised that young man's family their son would be home by evening. Now that might not happen, because someone at an airport counter didn't want to make a phone call or trust the uniform in front of them. Still, Harris didn't raise his voice. He gathered his documents, thanked them politely, and stepped aside. His dignity was something no one could take from him. He called the base transport officer, explained the situation, and was told it would take time to reauthorize a new booking. He nodded silently, even though no one on the other end could see. He sat down in a quiet corner of the terminal, far from the noise of passengers and announcements. Through the window he could see the cargo section in the distance where the casket was waiting. A wave of sadness washed over him. He wasn't angry for himself. He was angry for the soldier who deserved better. Nearby, a little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and pointed. "Mom, look, a soldier!" he whispered. The mother smiled politely at Harris and nodded. That simple gesture, small as it was, gave him the strength to hold his composure. He knew he would get through it. He always did. But deep down, he couldn't shake the question. Why was it still so hard for some people to believe in him, even in uniform, even on a mission of honor? The airport continued its ordinary rhythm, flights departing, announcements echoing, people laughing and chatting. But for Colonel Harris, that morning would mark the beginning of something bigger than a travel delay. It would become a story about dignity, respect, and the unseen struggles even the most disciplined men have to face when the world chooses not to see their worth. And as he sat there waiting for another call from the base, he silently promised the fallen soldier one thing. No matter how long it took, he would finish this duty. Because that's what soldiers do. They keep their promises even when the world makes it harder than it should be. The sound of flight announcements echoed softly through the airport as Colonel Harris sat in silence, his bag beside him, phone resting on his knee. It had been more than an hour since the airline staff told him he couldn't board the flight. He had tried to stay calm, polite, and patient, but inside, frustration was starting to build. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not today. Not when he was on duty to honor a soldier who had given his life. His phone buzzed again. It was the base transportation office. "Colonel, we're working on it," the officer said on the other end. "The airline's holding up the authorization, claiming there's a mismatch in the escort code. But everything on our end checks out. You're fully cleared." "I see," Harris said quietly. "Thank you. I'll wait here until it's sorted." He ended the call and looked toward the large window overlooking the tarmac. Somewhere out there, beyond those runways and blinking lights, a casket lay waiting to go home. A family was waiting too. probably checking their clocks, hoping everything was on schedule. He had promised them their son would be home by nightfall. He sighed and rubbed his hands together slowly. He could feel people glancing his way. Maybe it was the uniform, or maybe some had seen the earlier exchange at the counter. He had stood calmly, never raising his voice, even when he felt that sting of doubt in the air, that quiet disbelief that sometimes followed him no matter where he went. After another half hour, he decided to try again. He walked back to the counter, his folder in hand. The same woman was there, typing quickly on her keyboard. She looked up, a little startled when she saw him. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I just spoke to my command office. They confirmed everything is valid. Could you check again, please?" The woman hesitated. "Sir, I told you earlier the code isn't matching in our system. Until it's fixed, I can't print your boarding pass." "Then maybe your system is wrong," he replied, still polite but firmer now. "These orders come directly from the Department of Defense. I've escorted soldiers before. I know this process." Before she could respond, the supervisor returned, the same man who had doubted him earlier. "Sir, as I said, you'll need to wait until we can confirm through our central office," he said, keeping his tone flat. "How long will that take?" Harris asked. The man shrugged slightly. "Could be a few hours, maybe longer." Harris took a slow breath. He wasn't angry, at least not in a way that showed. But deep down, something inside him hurt. Not just for the delay, but for what it represented. He had been in the military long enough to know that respect should never depend on how someone looks, where they come from, or what color their skin is. Yet here he was, standing in full uniform, being treated as if his word and credentials meant nothing. He thought back to the young soldier he was escorting. That soldier had been full of hope, proud to wear the same uniform. Harris had always told his men that service was about unity, about being brothers and sisters in arms, not divided by anything else. But moments like this reminded him how fragile that unity could sometimes feel. "Sir," the supervisor said, "you can have a seat. We'll let you know when we have an update." "Thank you," Harris said simply and turned away. He walked to a quiet corner of the terminal again, his shoes echoing on the floor. As he sat, he noticed a woman nearby watching him with concern. She looked like an ordinary traveler, maybe in her 40s, holding a coffee and a boarding pass. "Excuse me," she said softly. I couldn't help overhearing. "Are you really escorting a soldier's remains?" "Yes, ma'am," Harris replied. "That's correct. And they're not letting you board?" He gave a small shake of his head. "Not yet. Some issue with authorization." The woman frowned, clearly bothered. "That doesn't sound right. You're doing something important. They should be helping you." He smiled faintly. "It's okay. These things happen." But she didn't seem convinced. She turned toward the counter, watching the employees behind it. Then she looked back at him. "You know, my father was in the army," she said softly. "He always told me that soldiers carry the weight of everyone else's freedom. I don't understand how anyone could disrespect that." Harris didn't respond, but her words stayed with him. It was comforting to know that at least some people still understood the meaning behind the uniform, the sacrifices it represented. A little later, as Harris sat scrolling through his phone, trying to distract himself, he heard raised voices nearby. A man standing a few feet away was recording something on his phone. "That's him," the man said quietly to someone next to him. "That's the officer they wouldn't let fly." Harris turned slightly. He hadn't realized people had been watching that closely. The man caught his eye and nodded respectfully. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you for what you're doing," he said. "I recorded a bit earlier when they turned you away. That wasn't right. Please don't make trouble," Harris said gently. "I just want to get this resolved." "I understand," the man said. "But people should know how they treated you." Harris didn't argue. He just nodded and turned back toward the window. He didn't want attention. He didn't want anger. All he wanted was to do his duty, to bring that young soldier home with honor. But by the end of the day, his story had already started spreading. The short video clip the traveler posted online began getting shared quickly. The comments were full of support. Veterans, families of soldiers, and ordinary citizens expressing outrage. They couldn't believe an officer in uniform on an escort mission had been denied a flight. Back at the airport, hours passed, and still no progress. The airline had called their central office, but no one seemed to take responsibility. Harris called the base again, and the transportation officer sounded frustrated. "Sir, I'm so sorry about this. We've verified everything, but they're refusing to accept the code. I'll escalate this to command. Do what you can, Harris said quietly. The family's expecting us. He ended the call and looked out once more at the fading sunlight. The day was slipping away, and the flight carrying the soldiers' remains was scheduled to depart soon. But without him, the mission wasn't complete. He couldn't let the soldier travel home alone. That went against every rule of honor he lived by. He stood up again and walked toward the service desk. His calm steps drew quiet looks from nearby passengers. "Ma'am," he said softly to the same woman, "please, can you check one more time? The flight is about to leave." She hesitated, avoiding his eyes. "I'm sorry, sir. The system still won't let me confirm it." He nodded slowly. "Then please tell your supervisor to make a call. Someone higher up. This isn't just a delay, this is disrespectful." His voice was still calm, but there was a weight behind it now. The kind of strength that comes from years of discipline and quiet endurance. The woman looked uncertain, then walked away to speak with her supervisor. Harris stayed where he was, standing tall, his presence quiet but powerful. A few passengers nearby whispered to each other. Some took out their phones. They didn't know the full story, but they could sense something wasn't right. It wasn't every day they saw a uniformed officer standing alone at a counter, being told he couldn't do his duty. A few minutes later, the supervisor returned again, looking uneasy. "Sir," he said, "I've contacted our regional manager. We'll try to verify this tonight, but for now I'm afraid the flight will have to depart without you." There was a long pause. Harris looked at him, then at the floor for a moment. He took a deep breath and straightened his shoulders. "Understood," he said quietly. "But know this, I won't let this go." He turned away and walked toward the window once more. Outside, ground crew were preparing the aircraft for departure. Somewhere inside that plane's cargo hold, the flag-covered casket waited. Watching it from the glass, Harris felt something heavy settle in his chest. He wasn't angry in a loud way. It was deeper than that, a quiet, painful disappointment. He had served his country for years, worn this uniform with pride, followed every rule. Yet somehow, when he needed the same respect he had always given, it wasn't there. The announcement for the flight echoed through the speakers. Passengers began lining up to board. Harris stayed where he was, watching through the glass as the plane's lights flickered and the engines started to hum. When it finally began to move down the runway, he stood silently, his hand raised in a slow, solemn salute. The plane lifted into the orange sky, carrying the fallen soldier home. Without him, he lowered his hand, his jaw tight, and whispered under his breath, "You deserved better." At that moment, he didn't know that someone had captured the scene. The lone officer standing at the window, saluting as the plane took off without him. The image would soon spread across the internet, touching thousands of hearts, but for now, all he felt was the weight of silence, and the quiet promise that this would not end here. That night, the airport lights glowed against the dark sky. Most travelers had gone home, but Colonel Harris was still there waiting. The flight he was supposed to be on had already left hours ago. The young soldier's casket was now in another city, traveling the last part of its journey without him. He sat quietly near a window, his uniform jacket neatly folded beside. When he finally left the airport, the world outside felt strangely quiet. The sun was rising, the streets empty except for a few cars. He stopped for a moment at the curb, watching as a flag on a nearby building fluttered in the soft wind. He thought about the soldier's family. By now they had probably received the casket. He had hoped to stand beside them when it arrived to offer comfort, to hand them the folded flag in person. Instead, they would wonder why he wasn't there. A military vehicle pulled up a few minutes later to take him back to base. The young driver looked uncomfortable, as if he didn't know what to say. "I saw the video, sir," he finally murmured. "People are talking about it everywhere." Harris didn't respond right away. He just looked out the window as the car started moving. "Let them talk," he said finally. "But I wish they were talking about the soldier instead." Back on base, things moved quickly. His commanding officer called him in, visibly upset about the incident. "This shouldn't have happened," the officer said firmly. "You were on official duty. You followed every rule. The airline was completely out of line." Harris nodded. "I'm not looking for trouble, sir. I just want to make sure no one else goes through something like this." The officer sighed. "I understand. But now it's bigger than us. The media's involved. The department's already preparing a formal response. That afternoon, the phone calls started coming in. Journalists, TV reporters, and radio hosts all wanted interviews. They wanted his reaction, his feelings, his side of the story. But Harris turned them all down. "I'm not interested in publicity," he told his assistant. "This isn't about me." Still, the world kept talking. Online, thousands of people were sharing messages of support. Veterans posted their own stories of being questioned or disrespected while in uniform. Military spouses shared how proud they were to see someone handle such humiliation with dignity. Some said they cried watching him salute that departing plane. By evening, the airline's public relations office released another statement, longer this time. They called the incident unfortunate and said they had deep respect for the armed forces, but the words felt hollow. Many people saw it as an attempt to control damage rather than take responsibility. Soon, the airline's customer service lines were flooded. People were canceling tickets, tagging the company in angry posts demanding accountability. "You disrespected a man who was escorting a hero," one comment read. "You don't deserve our business." At the same time, others were calling for calm. "Let's wait for the full story," some said. But the video spoke for itself. The image of Harris, tall, calm, and dignified, standing alone as the plane took off, was something people couldn't forget. A few days later, a major news channel aired a segment about the story. They showed the clip, blurred slightly for privacy, and then discussed the larger issue of how soldiers, especially those of color, still faced subtle prejudice, even in uniform. Experts debated, veterans gave their thoughts, and viewers sent in messages of support. Meanwhile, Harris tried to keep his focus on duty. He continued his work, attending meetings, checking reports, and preparing for the next deployment cycle. But no matter where he went, people recognized him now. Some saluted him with extra respect. Others stopped to shake his hand quietly. One afternoon, while walking across the base, a young recruit approached him hesitantly. "Sir," the recruit said, "I just wanted to say, what you did meant a lot to me. My father served too. He always said dignity is what separates a soldier from the rest of the world. You showed that." Harris smiled softly. "Thank you. Just remember, respect isn't something people give you. It's something you keep even when they try to take it away." The recruit nodded and Harris walked away, his thoughts heavy but calm. Days turned into a week. The story refused to fade. Every time the airline tried to move on, new posts appeared, new headlines surfaced. The family of the fallen soldier released a statement too. They thanked Colonel Harris for his dedication and said they were saddened he hadn't been allowed to complete the escort. "He promised to bring our son home," the family wrote. And we know in his heart, he did. That message touched thousands. It was shared widely, becoming one of the most talked about moments of the story. Many people said they cried reading it. It wasn't just about an airline anymore. It was about respect, about human decency, and about how one person's quiet strength could move an entire country. Finally, the airline reached out directly. A senior executive called Harris's commanding officer, asking to arrange a meeting and issue a personal apology. The military agreed but insisted it would be handled respectfully and privately. Harris agreed to attend, though he had mixed feelings. He didn't need an apology. He needed change. When the meeting took place, it was quiet and formal. The executives looked uncomfortable as they sat across from him. One of them began to speak. "Colonel, we want to sincerely apologize for what happened. It was never our intention to show disrespect. The incident was due to a system error and a lack of communication between our departments." Harris listened silently, hands folded in his lap. When they finished, he spoke in a calm but steady tone. "I appreciate your words. But this isn't just about me. It's about what this uniform stands for. That young soldier deserved to be treated with honor, not delay and doubt. I just hope you take steps to make sure this never happens again." The room was quiet for a moment. Then one of the executives nodded slowly. "You have our word, Colonel. We'll make it right." A few days later, the airline publicly announced new training for its employees. Mandatory courses on handling military escort travel, understanding veteran rights, and recognizing implicit bias. They also released a personal letter of apology to Harris and the soldier's family. Harris didn't celebrate the news. He didn't post about it or make a statement. He simply went back to his duties, back to the quiet routine of service. But deep down, he knew something had changed. Not just for him, But for many others who had watched and learned from his silence, everywhere he went, people treated him a little differently now, with a mix of respect and admiration. But he didn't let it go to his head. To him it wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about honor, something that should never depend on who you are or what you look like. That night, as he sat in his quarters, the base was quiet. He opened his phone and saw one last message, from the soldier's mother. It was short but full of warmth. "Thank you for standing for him. You brought him home with dignity even when they tried to stop you." Harris read it twice, then set the phone down. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to smile. He knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be challenges, moments where the world tested his patience, his faith, and his strength. But he also knew that every act of quiet courage, and even one, could make the world just a little better, and that was enough for him. The weeks that followed were quiet on the surface, but underneath everything was changing. The airline had issued their apology, the media had moved on to new stories, and the public's outrage had started to calm. But for Colonel Harris, the experience had left a mark that wouldn't fade so easily. He had returned to his duties as if nothing had happened. Every morning he still arrived at the base early, reviewed reports, led his team, and checked on the soldiers under his command. Outwardly, he was the same calm, disciplined leader he had always been. But there was a quiet heaviness behind his eyes, not anger, not bitterness, but a deep reflection about everything that had unfolded. One afternoon, as he walked across the parade ground, a fellow officer caught up to him. "You doing all right?" the man asked, glancing sideways at him. "I'm fine," Harris replied, adjusting his cap. "Doesn't seem like it," the other officer said. "That whole thing, it's hard to just shake off." Harris stopped for a moment and looked out across the field where a group of young recruits were training. "You know what's funny?" he said softly. "All my life I've told soldiers to hold their heads high, to believe that the uniform means respect. I still believe that. But now I also understand that sometimes it's not the uniform people see first. It's everything else." The officer nodded quietly. "Maybe, but the way you handled it, that showed more strength than anything else could have." Harris didn't reply. He simply gave a faint nod and continued walking. Later that evening, as he sat in his office finishing paperwork, there was a knock on the door. A young woman entered holding a file. She worked in communications and had been helping manage the flood of letters that had arrived since the story went viral. "Sir," she said, setting the folder on his desk. "These came in for you. Letters, emails, cards. We've been sorting them all week." He looked up, surprised. "All for me?" "Yes, sir. From people all over the country. Veterans, families, even kids. Some just wanted to say thank you. Others shared their own stories." She left the folder on his desk and quietly stepped out. When she was gone, Harris opened the folder slowly. Inside were dozens of letters. Handwritten notes, printed emails, small folded cards. He picked one at random and began to read. "Dear Colonel, I don't know you, but I saw what happened at the airport. I just wanted to say you handled it with grace and dignity. My husband served for 20 years, and I wish he could have seen how calm you stayed. You made us proud." He read another. "My son was in the Air Force. He passed away." And in that quiet moment beneath the vast open sky, Colonel Harris felt peace again. The kind of peace that comes only when you know you've done the right thing, no matter how hard it was. Months had passed since the day Colonel Harris escorted the fallen soldier home. Seasons had changed and life had moved forward, but his quiet act of dignity had left ripples that continued to spread far beyond what he could see. The world had moved on to other stories, other headlines, but in small ways people still remembered. At the base, things had returned to routine. Early mornings began with the sound of boots on pavement, the hum of engines starting, and the sharp echoes of commands cutting through the air. Harris walked the grounds each morning, his posture still straight, his gaze steady. To most who saw him, he was the same as always, calm, focused, and steady in his purpose. But there was something softer in him now. Maybe it was wisdom. Maybe it was the quiet relief that even through pain and misunderstanding, something good had come out of it. One morning, he received a call from the National Veterans Foundation. The voice on the other end was warm and sincere. "Colonel," the man said, "we're organizing a public ceremony to honor those who've gone above and beyond in service, not just on the battlefield, but in upholding the dignity of others. We'd like you to attend." Harris hesitated. He had never been one for ceremonies or recognition. "I appreciate it," he replied gently. "But I just did what anyone should have done." The man chuckled softly. "That's exactly why we want you there." A week later, he stood on a small outdoor stage surrounded by veterans, families, and civilians. The air was cool and clear, and flags waved quietly in the breeze. As he stepped forward to speak, the crowd fell silent. "I'm not here because of what happened to me," he began. "I'm here because of what that moment reminded me, and maybe reminded some of you too. Respect isn't something we should have to ask for. It's something we owe each other, no matter the uniform, no matter the color of our skin, no matter our background." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "Every time we forget that, we lose a little bit of what makes us human." There was a hush in the air. Then slowly people began to clap, not loudly but with deep feeling. Many stood, some with tears in their eyes. After the ceremony, an older woman approached him. She held a small framed photo of her son in uniform. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "He didn't make it back," she said softly. "But watching how you carried yourself, how you stood up for respect, it gave me peace. You reminded people that our children mattered." Harris's throat tightened. He nodded respectfully, his voice barely above a whisper. "They'll always matter," he said. The woman smiled faintly, touched his arm, and walked away, leaving him with a feeling he couldn't quite put into words. In the months that followed, Harris was invited to speak at schools, community centers, and veteran gatherings. He didn't see himself as a hero, but people wanted to hear his story. Not for the drama, but for the lesson it carried. He would tell them about the fallen soldier, about the airport, and about the long flight home. But he always ended his talks the same way. Dignity isn't something someone gives you. It's something you carry within yourself, and no one can take it away unless you let them. Every time he said those words, people would nod. Some would smile. Others would cry quietly. One evening, after giving a talk at a small high school, he was approached by a student who looked nervous but determined. "Sir," the young man said, "I've been thinking about joining the Army. My dad says it's not for people like us, that we'll just be treated unfairly. But when I heard your story, it made me believe it's not about what people think. It's about what you stand for. So, thank you." Harris felt a deep sense of pride. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder and said, "If you serve, do it with honor. Not for anyone's approval, for your own peace of mind. The uniform doesn't change who you are. It just gives you a chance to show the world what you're made of." That conversation stayed with him long after he left the school. It reminded him why it all mattered, why even one small act of grace could ripple out into something far greater. Back at the base, the atmosphere felt a little different these days. People greeted each other with more awareness. Officers made sure travel escorts were handled properly. Small things maybe, but meaningful ones. The change wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, the kind that lasts. One morning, as Harris walked into the office, a young officer stopped him. "Sir, I heard we're updating the escort procedures again," she said. "They mentioned your case as the reason for the improvements." He smiled slightly. "Good," he said. "That means the lesson stuck." The officer hesitated. "Sir, if you don't mind me saying, I think what you did changed more than just procedures. It reminded people what respect really looks like." Harris didn't know how to respond. He simply nodded, thankful but humble. Later that day, he sat at his desk looking out the window. The sun was high, the sky a soft shade of blue. He thought about everything that had happened, the airport, the outrage, the apology, the reforms, and the quiet understanding that followed. It had been a long, painful road, but now looking back, he could finally see the full picture. The experience hadn't been about humiliation or anger. It had been about purpose, about showing what real leadership looks like when tested. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. It was the same young communications officer who had brought him the letters months ago. "Sir," she said with a smile, "we've received another package for you." He raised an eyebrow. "Another one?" "Yes, sir. It's from the soldier's family." He took the small box and opened it slowly. Inside was a folded note and a medal. The note read, "Colonel, we wanted you to have this. It belonged to our son. You carried him home with honor. Now we hope you'll carry this as a reminder that you gave him, and us, the respect he deserved." Harris sat back in his chair, quiet for a long time. The medal gleamed softly in his hand. He wasn't one to cry easily, but in that moment his eyes stung with emotion. He placed the medal in a small glass case on his desk, beside the folded letter from the soldier's mother. It wasn't about recognition. It was about remembrance, about connection. As time went on, life carried him to new places and new responsibilities. He continued serving, mentoring, and inspiring others. His story became something people shared not for its controversy, but for its message, a message of respect, patience, and quiet courage. Years later, when he finally retired, a ceremony was held in his honor. It wasn't grand or filled with cameras. It was simple, just as he liked it, a gathering of soldiers, friends, and families who had served alongside him. When he was asked to speak one last time, he looked out over the crowd and smiled. "We all face moments when the world tests who we are," he said. "Sometimes those moments come when we least expect them. But what matters most isn't the challenge, it's how we carry ourselves through it. Respect isn't something you wait for. It's something you give even when it's not given back." The crowd stood and applauded. Many had tears in their eyes. As the sun dipped low on the horizon that evening, Harris walked across the empty field outside the base. The sky glowed in soft orange and gold. He paused, looking up at the fading light, feeling a sense of peace settle deep in his chest. He thought of the fallen soldier whose journey had started it all, the young man who had never come home alive, but whose final flight had changed so many lives. "Rest easy," Harris whispered quietly. "We made it, right?" The wind moved gently through the grass, almost like an answer. He stood there for a while longer, watching the last bit of sunlight disappear behind the hills. In that quiet moment, he understood that dignity isn't a one-time act. It's something you carry with you every day, in how you treat others and how you face the world. And as he walked away from the field, his footsteps slow and steady, there was no bitterness left, only peace. Because sometimes the hardest struggles bring out the truest strength, and in the end, what matters most isn't how the world treats you, but how you choose to rise above it.